when we think of categories, some of the easiest categories to form are natural categories. So those are features that animals are evolutionarily predisposed to use, like predator and prey, or food/non-food. Right, that makes sense. Information that's important to your evolutionary history makes sense. You'd be able to categorize it correctly. Okay, another kind of categorization talked about perceptual categorization, talked about natural categories. You can think about functional categorization. So this is grouping items or events based on shared meaning or association. So these are all modes of transport. So they have shared meaning. We talked about perceptual categorization. So grouping things based off of some kind of feature associated with a sensory modality. So blue versus red. Right? We actually see in humans that perceptual categorization is something that happens before functional categorization occurs. So children will categorize by perceptual categorization before they categorize by functional categorization. So functional categorization has a higher cognitive load than perceptual categorization does. And like I said, it follows perceptual categorization developmentally. So functional categorization seems to be present in fewer non-human animals than perceptual categorization does. But it's a pretty adaptive kind of categorization that we have, because it's determined by meaningful relationships. There is more meaning there. Blue versus red might not have as much meaning as, predator and prey. The function. Okay. There's also relational categorization. So this is grouping items together based on similar connections or relational properties. They're also relative and not absolute. So an example here would be, choose the larger stimulus, or are these stimuli the same, or are they different? So you're looking at two items relative to each other. Items, events, objects, whatever they are. Okay, so can animals learn relational categories? We already said they use perceptual more often than functional. But can they learn relational categories? So they can. But most animals, and most of the work we know of is from pigeons, can perform well on tests with relational categories, but they've had hundreds of training trials. Like they're trained a lot to get to that point. So they can do it, but it's not necessarily an automatic kind of way of categorizing information. Right, and one interpretation is that through this extensive kind of training, animals are actually extracting perceptual information that's meaningful, that allows them to be successful rather than actually learning relational properties. Okay. So one example of an experiment looking at relational matching in chimpanzees. So basically there'd be these different objects that food is hidden under. So the experimenters hidden food under one of these objects. And then the chimp has to point to the correct object. And it's all about relational matching. So if the experimenter puts the food under the largest cup, the chimp has to point to its largest cup. They may not be the same size. So again, it's how the objects are in relation to each other, right? So these are all the various kinds of scenarios that the experimenters went through with the chimps. So we can go through a couple. They're not all necessarily important. But here would be kind of the simplest. It is a physical match. So they have to pick the exact same size. So what you're looking at, this is the experimenter's side at the top, and this is the chimp side on the bottom. Okay? Different objects. And the arrows show the correct choices. Okay, the arrows show the correct choices. Okay. Here, you might have a 2-item or 3-item. More items is always going to be harder, right, than less. So the experimenter hid the food under the 1, the smallest, right? So the chimp has to point to the smallest in its set. Same here. Now they're pointing, or they put the food under the biggest. The chimp has to point to the biggest. Okay. That's kind of the idea here. So we're trying to see, okay, do the chimps have this relational matching? And they did find that some of the chimps could do this task. Okay, so some of them could perform relatively well. So here what you're seeing, the chimp has to be using analogical reasoning about relationships. Selecting not just based on the relationship, but applying that relationship to a novel and distinct set of stimuli. Okay. And they find that some of the chimps do well, and others don't. The textbook talks about this in a bit more detail. But basically, the chimps might be using a different kind of set of rules than actually relational matching. So the jury's still out on this, if the chimps can relationally categorize items. Okay. Let's move on to social categorization. I think I had a slide in there too. I deleted in that section. Don't worry about that. Ignore it. Okay. It's fine. All right, social categorization. So this is the process of classifying organisms, conspecifics, or not always conspecifics. It's the process of classifying organisms into groups like conspecifics, members of your own species, heterospecifics, members of a different species, familiar, unfamiliar, and then kin or non-kin. So, am I related to this individual or not? That's what kin means. Are you related genetically? Okay. So conspecific recognition. Identifying one member of a species by another member. So conspecific recognition, also sometimes called intraspecies recognition. I can recognize that you are all my conspecifics, you are all human beings, right? But if there was a dog in here, I'd also know they're not a member of my species. It's of course important for reproduction. evolutionarily speaking, you need to know the members of your own species versus the members that are not of your species. Okay. So when we're thinking about conspecific recognition, there have been some research with newborn babies of both the human variety and the monkey variety. And in general, newborn humans prefer to look at human faces compared to monkey faces. And newborn rhesus monkeys also prefer to look at monkey faces, but interestingly prefer to look at humans if they've been raised around humans. Okay, so we know that conspecific recognition is largely innate in there, but with a learning component, and you can see that with that example with the rhesus monkeys also liking to look at human faces if they've been around humans, so there's a learning component there, right? Okay. Why? Well, because animals are not always raised under identical conditions. Right? So being flexible is actually quite adaptive. It's quite adaptive. But there are limits, of course. We're pretty highly related to monkeys, and we have lots of similar features. For example, monkeys wouldn't prefer to look at elephant faces if they were around lots of elephants compared to monkeys and humans. Okay. So it's important to be flexible to an extent. To an extent. Okay. So kin recognition, recognizing your family, your genetic family. So it's often necessary not only to recognize your own species, but also to recognize your own kin, like related individuals. And of course, this is evolutionarily adaptive to avoid inbreeding. Reproducing with a member of kin can create all sorts of issues in the offspring, right? And that means poor fitness when you're thinking about evolution. So you want to avoid inbreeding for good fitness. And of course, it's important for providing an evolutionary advantage to related individuals. Helping your own genes, even if they're in other individuals, related individuals, right? So it's important to be able to recognize your own kin, to avoid inbreeding, but also to help your own kin, which helps your own genes. There's also parent-offspring recognition, recognizing your children or your parents. And we know this idea of imprinting, filial imprinting. We know that idea of geese, they imprint on the first organism they see as their mother. Right? And that is a real phenomenon that happens. But that's important for these geese, right? That's one way. That's one mechanism of parent-offspring recognition is with imprinting, even though sometimes it can be incorrect. Right? Usually, though, that doesn't really happen. Okay. So, there's lots of reasons why it would be important to recognize your parent or your offspring. Of course, it's important, for example, in animals with huge social colonies like bats. You go away to find food and you come back, you have to be able to recognize your offspring and feed just your offspring, right? That's pretty important. Sometimes there can be failure in parent-offspring recognition. So, for example, we talked about brown-headed cowbirds as brood parasites, but cuckoos are another example of brood parasites. So they lay eggs in the nests of other species and allow those species to raise their offspring. And the parasitized birds often fail to recognize the eggs or nestlings from the cuckoo bird. I actually saw a really funny video showing this kind of phenomenon. I'll put it on the owl. I can't find it right now at this second, but it's very funny. A friend sent it to me this morning. Okay. But, I mean, they do a very good job of hiding their eggs. So this is an example from cuckoo birds. See, these are all different species of birds. So we have great reed warblers, and redstarts. And these are all nests of their eggs, but then the arrow is actually pointing to the cuckoo egg. So they're also able to kind of mimic what the eggs are supposed to look like. In some places you can see, well, it's a little off, the color's a little off here, the size is a little different, but it's a pretty good match. Same here. The size is a little different, but pretty good. And this one's probably the sneakiest, right? But even after the eggs have hatched, sometimes the parents mistake the nestlings as their own. And I'll share an example of that, showing that on the owl. Okay. So sometimes there's a failure of parent-offspring recognition. It does occur. How does that happen? How can we tell? There are lots of different cues that are used. Through olfaction, through auditory cues, and of course also through facial features, depending on the animal. And there is quite a bit of work showing that people who are genetically related and animals who are genetically related share a smell. Okay. So there are different kinds of cues, sensory cues, animals and people use to tell if they're related to an individual or not. But it can be hard. It is difficult to know if animals are using the rule, either I am related to this individual, or I spent a great deal of time with this individual in the past. You spend a great deal of time, in general, with parents and offspring, right? Spend quite a bit of time. Maybe that's what's happening in that failure of parent-offspring recognition in the cuckoos. Maybe. There's a lot of theories about what's going on there. But it's hard to know which rule the animals are using. Okay. What about recognition of unfamiliar kin? This has to be, I am unrelated to this individual, or using the rule, testing the rule, I am related to this individual. Because in many species, offspring disperse. They don't stick around at home the whole time. So birds, for example, may have different offspring, like different years, right? Those offspring still need to recognize their unfamiliar kin and not reproduce with them, right? So it's likely that animals and species where offspring disperse, because it'll still be in the same general geographical area. They'll encounter kin that they've had no previous interactions with. So, recognizing kin you're genetically related to that you're unfamiliar with, you haven't spent a great deal of time with. And here, those chemical signals are probably pretty important. Thinking about olfaction. And again, there's work to show that distinct DNA profiles can result in distinct olfactory profiles as well, so different smells. Okay. How does this happen? Originally, there was some work kind of hypothesizing that it has to do with nesting in the same geographic region. That's why they can tell. Oops, almost fell. But we know that it's probably more complicated than that. Just natal philopatry. But for example, in blue petrels, we know that each bird emits a distinct chemical signal. That's one example. And in another interesting experiment, they used mice, because mice have such good olfactory systems, right? And we can put them in the lab. It's easy to get access to mice. It's easy to train mice. And they were provided with different smells of different birds, some related, some unrelated, and the mice could discriminate between those different smells. So they are actually different odors, at least to the mice, but assumed to the birds as well. Okay. So how do animals know when they sense a particular olfactory profile, a particular smell profile that matches their own smell profile? Well, they'll use something called phenotypic matching. So comparing the observable traits of another individual to one's own observable traits. Basically, do they smell like me? That's phenotypic matching in the example of an olfactory profile. But of course, you could do that phenotypic matching with they look like me, they sound like me, right? So an assumption, though, of phenotypic matching is that genetic matching underlies phenotypic matching. So there's an association between the genotype and the phenotype. Right? Okay. A nice example of phenotypic matching is found in golden hamsters that were cross-fostered. So basically, hamsters were raised by non-kin, so a foster mother, and then tested to see if their genetic mother odor or their foster mother's odor was more familiar. Nice example. Okay, so you have one mother of a hamster, right, has babies. Okay, one mother has babies, but then they're raised by a different mother. This picture is very soothing to me. Okay, all right, and then we'll present them with the odors of these two different mothers, right? And see, okay, which odor does the hamster find more familiar? Aha, and they find the genetic one more familiar. So even though they're raised with a completely different, unrelated mother, they're spending a lot of time with that foster mother, They find the smell, they find the odor of their genetic mother more familiar. Okay. Okay, individual recognition. So some animals are able to recognize individuals. So members of your own species, but you're able to recognize different people, right? Just like you can recognize that you have different professors and they're all different people, right? Or I can recognize that you guys are different. So humans are, of course, very good at this. And because we're generally good at it, there's even, when people are bad at it, there's a disorder associated with that. Prosopagnosia, right? Face blindness. But many other species can identify individuals as well. So we know giant pandas can. These are some examples, bullfrogs, and even in the insect family, paper wasps can identify different individuals. They have different faces. They have different features on their faces, which is kind of neat. Right? So they can discriminate between different individuals. They can recognize different individuals. Less soothing pictures. But pretty neat. Okay. Oops. So are individuals being recognized by one feature or a collection of features? Well, it seems that some animals appear to recognize an individual and not rely exclusively on one feature. So it is a set. It's a combination of features in animals that can do individual recognition. Okay, so what is different about individual recognition? Well, it's entirely dependent on experience. It's entirely dependent on experience. And really, it's often based on aggressive or territorial encounters. Maybe not as much in humans, but in other animals, my guide keeps coming onto my territory. I know it's him, right? And that's meaningful information. That's adaptive information. Makes sense. Okay. All right. So to summarize, social categorization is really the classification of individuals, other individuals, into different groups, and it allows animals to recognize members of their own species or not. It allows animals to recognize kin or non-kin. It also allows animals to discriminate between different individuals. And it's really important for social interactions. All right. And we'll talk about social interactions the next time we have class. Of course, next week is the test. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys next week. Thanks a lot.